Pam Bondi never thought her day would go this way. She was sitting in a courtroom just like she had many times before. She was ready for a quick hearing, something small that wouldn't take long. But today felt different. She sat at the defendant's table looking through her papers. Across from her, another lawyer, the city attorney, adjusted his tie and waited. They were waiting for the judge to come in. The case was not a big deal. It was supposed to be a small matter, something that would take only a few minutes. But when Judge Raymond Harrison walked in, Pam felt something was wrong. Judge Harrison was a serious-looking man. He was tall, had a gray beard and deep-set eyes. He looked like someone who had a lot of power. Usually, judges take a moment to settle in, look at papers and greet the lawyers. But not Judge Harrison. "Let's get right to it," he said in a flat voice. Pam sat up a little straighter. She could tell something was off. "The court has looked at everything," Judge Harrison said. "And after thinking about it, I find that the defendant has broken the law and must pay a fine of $10,000. The payment is due immediately." The courtroom went quiet. Pam raised an eyebrow, but inside, her mind was racing. She had expected a discussion, maybe a chance to explain her side. But this? A judgment without even letting her speak? The city attorney looked at her, almost like he felt bad. He hadn't expected it to happen this fast either. Pam calmly placed her hands on the table. She kept her voice even. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even started. I haven't had a chance to say anything." Judge Harrison barely moved. "There's nothing to say. The rule is clear." Pam took a slow breath. The room was too quiet. Something felt strange about this. This wasn't just about a simple fine. The way Harrison was handling it, it felt personal. She looked at the judge carefully. There was something in his eyes, a confidence, a power that wasn't just about the law. He wasn't just ruling on a case. He was making a point. Pam kept her voice firm. "If the rule is that clear, then why are we here? I request to present my side." Judge Harrison leaned back slightly as if he had expected her to argue. His lips curled, but it wasn't really a smile. "Go ahead, Ms. Bondi, but the answer will be the same." That's when Pam knew. This wasn't about the case. This was about her. She adjusted the papers in front of her. Not because she needed to, but to make a point. The fine wasn't the problem. She had fought bigger battles. But the principle of it, what was right and fair, that mattered. She looked directly at Harrison. "Then I guess we should begin." The air in the room changed. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter, who had been sitting still, adjusted in her seat. Even the people watching in the back of the room leaned in, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Pam looked at the papers one last time, even though she already knew what she was going to say. She was ready. Before anyone could speak again, she lifted her hand. A small gesture, but it made people pause. Then she spoke. "What I'm hearing, Your Honor, is that I don't have the right to defend myself. Is that correct?" Judge Harrison didn't react much. "I'm saying that you broke the rule and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Interesting." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back a little, making her voice sound casual. "It's just that I've been a lawyer for a long time. And in all those years, I've never seen a judge decide a case before hearing the defense. It's, what's the word? Unusual." Judge Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. Pam knew what she was doing. She wasn't fighting him directly yet. She was setting the stage, making him respond. The people in the room were watching closely now. Some of them, other lawyers and clerks, exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, the guard standing by, shifted slightly. This wasn't just a normal hearing anymore. Judge Harrison let out a slow breath. "Ms. Bondi, this courtroom is not for drama. If you have something to say, say it. If not, we are done here." Pam gave a small smile. "Of course, Your Honor." She picked up a paper and flipped to a page. Again, she didn't need to. It was for effect. Then she looked up. "You said the rule is clear. But I'd like to ask, have you reviewed the case details fully?" Harrison's eyes narrowed. "I have reviewed what is necessary." Pam nodded again. "Necessary. Right. But let's make sure we agree on what's necessary." She paused, letting the room stay silent for a moment. Then she continued. "The law you're referring to, 14B, correct?" Harrison said nothing. Pam answered her own question. "Yes, 14B. A city rule that has certain requirements. But the key detail is in Section 3, which states that a violation only exists under specific conditions. Have we confirmed that those conditions apply?" Harrison's face didn't change, but the way he held himself did. Pam pressed on. "Because if those conditions do not apply, then the violation does not exist. And if the violation does not exist, the fine does not exist. She let the words settle. The people in the room held their breath. Harrison tapped his fingers on his desk. Are you arguing that the conditions do not apply? Pam smiled just a little. I'm arguing that we should find out. Harrison stared at her. Then, for the first time since he walked in, he picked up a file and actually looked at it. He flipped through the pages. His expression remained serious, but now he was paying attention. Pam didn't speak. She let the silence work in her favor. After a long pause, Harrison placed the file down. Ms. Bondi, are you suggesting that this case needs further review? Pam nodded. Yes, Your Honor. That is exactly what I'm suggesting. The city attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Harrison held up a hand, stopping him. He looked at Pam for another long moment. Then he sighed. The court will take a brief recess. He stood up and walked toward his chambers. The courtroom let out a quiet buzz. People whispered to each other. The city attorney leaned over. You knew that, didn't you? He asked Pam. Pam simply smiled. I had a feeling. She leaned back in her chair, waiting. The fight wasn't over yet, but she had just turned the game around. Pam gave a small smile. She knew what was happening. There it was. The judge had just opened the door for her to speak. She held her papers again, but this time she didn't look down at them. She looked straight at the judge. All right, she said. Let's talk about Rule 14b. The one you say I broke. She tapped her finger on the paper in front of her. You say the rule is simple and clear. But that's funny because I know that this same rule has been questioned many times in the last 5 years. And every time people see it in different ways. Harrison, the judge, narrowed his eyes. For example, Pam went on, her voice calm and steady. The words in Section C of this rule are so confusing that at least 3 different judges said it can't be used. She kept her eyes on the judge. And don't forget, just last year, another court said that giving people fines without a fair chance to defend themselves is unfair. It breaks the rules that protect people's rights. The room went quiet. Pam could feel the mood changing. The judge knew it too. Harrison straightened up, his voice sharper now. Those cases don't matter here. Pam didn't even blink. Don't they? She turned another page in her papers. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like they do. In the case of Reynolds versus Clearwater, the judge said it very clearly. If someone gets a fine without the chance to show their side of the story, that fine can be thrown out. She let her words settle in before adding, and I'm sure, Your Honor, that you wouldn't want to ignore what other judges have already decided. Harrison's jaw tightened. Pam let the silence hang in the air just long enough. Then she delivered the next blow. Unless, of course, this court wants to ignore important decisions from the past. If so, I'll be happy to appeal this case. Harrison leaned forward and folded his hands together. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi? Pam let out a small breath through her nose, a laugh without any humor. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I just remind you of the law. A quiet buzz spread through the back of the courtroom. People in the room knew what had just happened. Pam had done something small but very important. She had changed the way things were going. She had made the judge answer her instead of just telling her what to do. Harrison knew it too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly, cleared his throat, ready to speak. But before he could, Harrison raised a hand, stopping him. His eyes stayed on Pam's. There was a long pause. Then, finally, the judge spoke. All right. You may present your case. Pam gave a small smile, but she wasn't celebrating yet. This was just the beginning. She was about to speak again when she noticed something. Harrison wasn't going to make this easy. He didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward. He locked his fingers together and said, Go on. His voice was strong. It didn't sound like he was just giving her permission. It sounded like a warning. Pam knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about the rule anymore. It was about control. He wanted to make sure she knew who was in charge. But Pam wasn't afraid. She sat up straight, her face calm. Let's start with the rule itself, she said, tapping her papers. Rule 14b says that any person or business that doesn't follow the city's rules can be fined. Sounds simple, right? But the problem is how they decide who is following the rules and who isn't. The words in the rule are too confusing. And that makes it unfair. Harrison sighed, looking unimpressed. And yet, Ms. Bondi, this rule has been used many times without any problem. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting because, according to public records, at least 4 cases were dismissed because of this same problem. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Harrison. Unless you're saying that fairness only matters when it's convenient. Harrison gripped the bench a little tighter. Ms. Bondi, he said, "If your argument is just about small details, I suggest you think again. The rule is written and it is followed." Pam let the room stay silent for a moment. Then she said, "Except when it isn't." Another quiet murmur spread through the room. Pam reached for another document and held it up. "Let's talk about Henderson versus St. Petersburg. The person in that case was fined under this same rule. The words were the same. The way they enforced it was the same. But the court said that the city broke the rules." She paused. Then she continued, "Do you know what the judge said in that case? He said that the rule doesn't explain clearly enough what people need to do, which makes it unfair. So the fine was thrown out." Harrison's face didn't change, but Pam could see his jaw tighten slightly. The city attorney leaned in trying to speak. "Your Honor, I think we're getting off track." Pam turned to him, cutting him off. "Counselor, I'd love to hear how you explain why this ruling doesn't apply here. If you have a reason why Henderson's case doesn't matter, please, go ahead and tell us." The attorney hesitated. He didn't seem to have an answer. Pam turned back to Harrison. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness. If a higher court already decided this rule is unfair, then how can this court use it to fine me?" Harrison sat back. His eyes scanned her, thinking. Pam knew what he was doing. He was trying to find a way out. He was looking for a way to take back control. Finally he spoke. "The situation in that case was not exactly the same as yours." Pam nodded. "That's true. But the decision still applies. The law has to be clear. Otherwise, it isn't fair." Silence. The room had changed. Pam could feel it. She knew she had the judge stuck, not just because he was wrong, but because now whatever he decided would be watched very closely. He had two choices. He could go forward with the fine and risk being proven wrong later, or he could step back and admit that he might have made a mistake. Pam waited, watching him. Would he ignore what the other judges had said? Would he risk having his ruling overturned? Or would he back down and admit that he had been too quick to punish her? Harrison didn't speak right away. The whole room waited. Pam didn't move. She didn't rush him. She knew she had already done what she needed to do. Now it was up to him. Pam didn't want to be in the judge's place. But he had put himself there, so she didn't feel sorry for him. Judge Harrison took a deep breath. "Ms. Bondi, I don't agree with your argument." Pam gave a small smile. "Then let's talk about it." The judge's nose flared a little, and then, to her surprise, he picked up his gavel. "The court will take a 15-minute break." He stood up before anyone could say anything. Then he turned and walked away into his office. Pam put down her papers and stayed calm on the outside. But inside, she knew what was happening. Harrison wasn't ready to agree with her, but he also wasn't ready to say she was wrong. He needed time, to think, to come up with a new plan, or maybe even to check the law case she had mentioned. That meant she had him trapped. But when he came back, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next was going to change everything. 15 minutes felt like a very long time. Pam stayed in her chair at the defense table. Her hands rested lightly on her papers. She wasn't reading them, she didn't need to. The laws, the rules, and the cases she talked about were already in her head. She was ready. But something felt off. Harrison never hesitated. If he was taking time, it meant he was planning something new. The door to the judge's office opened. Harrison walked back in, but this time he wasn't alone. Another judge was with him. Pam knew right away who he was. Judge Alan Reynolds. He was a senior judge, higher ranking than Harrison. The moment Reynolds entered, the feeling in the courtroom changed. This was not normal. Bringing another judge in the middle of a case wasn't just unusual, it was a move, a plan. Pam sat up straighter and made sure her face didn't show any emotion. Harrison sat down and cleared his throat. "Before we continue, I have asked Judge Reynolds to be here." Asked? Pam didn't believe that. Someone had called in a favor. Reynolds gave her a small nod. His face was calm but serious. "Ms. Bondi, I understand you have concerns about how Statute 14b is being used." Pam looked at him directly. "Yes." Reynolds put his hands together. "You believe the fine should be removed because of a past court decision?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't just believe it, I know it." A small murmur spread through the room. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate your confidence. But let's talk about the details." He looked at her carefully. "You mentioned the case of Henderson versus the city of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that later, another ruling said some parts of the law could still be used, depending on the local judge's choice?" Pam kept her face calm, but inside, she understood what was happening. Harrison had stepped back and brought in a higher judge. Now they were trying to argue against her using a small, tricky detail from another case. Pam folded her hands. Yes, I know about that ruling, Your Honor. But I also know that the ruling said the law could only be used if there was strong proof. And in this case, there was no strong proof. Reynolds nodded, like he had expected her to say that. Then let's talk about that. The officer who gave this fine is here today. Would you like to ask him some questions? Pam almost showed her surprise. She hadn't expected that. But she was glad. It gave her an opportunity. She turned as a man stood up from the back of the courtroom. Officer Brian Calloway. He was a municipal enforcement officer. He looked confident, like someone who was used to making decisions without being questioned. Pam spoke calmly. Yes, Your Honor. I would. Harrison motioned for Calloway to come forward. The officer walked to the witness stand, took an oath, and sat down. Pam got up and walked toward him, taking slow steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you gave this fine? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the public seating area where people were watching the case. And why did you decide a violation had happened? Calloway sighed like the answer was obvious. The law is clear. The property was not following city rules. I saw it and I gave the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any pictures of the problem? He hesitated. No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary. Pam gave him a small, almost amused smile. You didn't take any pictures, but you still gave a fine? Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience in these cases. I didn't need a photo. I knew what I saw. Pam kept her face calm, but inside she knew she had just won an important point. She turned back to the judges. Your Honor, without photos, witness statements, or any real proof, all we have is one person's opinion. And that does not meet the legal standards required by the law. Reynolds didn't show any reaction, but he leaned back slightly in his chair. He knew she was right. Pam continued. So, I ask again, how can this court allow a fine when there is no legal proof to support it? The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Harrison's fingers drummed against his desk. He wasn't looking at Reynolds, and that told Pam everything. Harrison had thought he would win. He had thought bringing in Reynolds would make Pam give up. But instead, she had turned his own argument against him. Harrison exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to fight back. But when they returned, what Harrison did next would shock everyone. The courtroom was filled with whispers. Another break? That was not a good sign for Harrison. It meant he was losing control. Pam knew better than to celebrate yet. Harrison was a powerful judge, and people in power hated losing. He wouldn't give up that easily. When the court started again, Harrison looked different. His confidence was gone. His jaw was tight, his face unreadable. Reynolds was still sitting beside him, but this time he looked more relaxed, like he wasn't going to step in. Harrison cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, you have made strong arguments. His voice was careful. Pam could hear the tension in it. He didn't like admitting she had a point. However, he continued, this court still believes the fine should remain. Pam blinked. That was interesting. So, he was refusing to change his decision. She took a slow breath, nodding as if she was thinking about it. Then, without missing a beat, Pam stood in the courtroom facing the judge. The room was quiet. She turned to the woman sitting at a small desk, typing very fast. This woman was the court stenographer, a person who writes down every word spoken in court. Can you read back the last statement, please? Pam asked. The stenographer, a woman with sharp eyes, nodded and repeated the words she had just typed. The fine stands, Pam, she said. Pam turned back to the judge, a man named Harrison. He sat on a high bench, looking serious. Your Honor, Pam said, just so I understand correctly, are you saying that a person can get a fine without any proof? That goes against the law. Judge Harrison's fingers twitched. He didn't like this question. Ms. Bondi, he said, this court has the power to make decisions. Pam smiled just a little. Yes, she said, but having power doesn't mean you can ignore the rules. The city attorney, the lawyer working for the government, shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable. He could see that Pam was making a strong argument. Pam stood taller and stepped closer to the judge's bench. Let's make this simple, she said. If this ruling stays, it means any officer can fine someone just by saying they did something wrong. No proof, no pictures, nothing. Just their words. The courtroom was silent. Pam looked at the people sitting in the gallery, lawyers, clerks, and visitors. Some of them nodded. They understood what she was saying. Pam turned back to the judge. "That's not power," she said. "That's unfair." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then another judge, named Reynolds, spoke. "You're saying that if this fine is allowed, it will be unfair to people who want to defend themselves?" Pam nodded. "Not just unfair," she said. "It would make the whole system weak. If we start allowing punishments without proof, soon the whole legal system will stop being fair." Judge Harrison gripped the bench tightly. He knew Pam was right. The city attorney opened his mouth to speak, but the judge held up his hand. His face was hard to read, but Pam could tell he was frustrated. Finally, after a long silence, Judge Harrison let out a deep breath. "This court finds that the fine does not have enough proof to be enforced. The fine is canceled." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Pam nodded politely. She didn't smile or celebrate. She didn't need to. She had won. The judge hit his gavel on the bench. "Court is adjourned." It was over. Pam gathered her papers, placing them neatly in her folder. As she walked toward the exit, she noticed Judge Reynolds watching her. His face showed no emotion. Just as she reached the door, she heard Judge Harrison's voice again. "Miss Bondi." She turned. Harrison looked at her. "I underestimated you." Pam gave a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom. Her heels clicked against the shiny floor. She knew one thing for sure: this case wouldn't be forgotten. It had set a new rule, and other judges would remember it. Next time, they would think twice before making unfair decisions. Pam walked down the long marble hallway. Her steps were steady, her mind still sharp. She knew what had just happened was important. She had walked into the courtroom expecting an ordinary case, but it turned into a fight. A fight about power, rules, and fairness. And she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Judge Harrison didn't forget things like this. They didn't like losing, especially in front of a room full of people. As she neared the courthouse exit, she heard someone call her name. "Miss Bondi, a moment?" She turned. It was Judge Reynolds. He had followed her. Pam crossed her arms. "Something on your mind?" Judge Reynolds studied her. He wasn't the kind of man who wasted words, so if he stopped her now, it was for an important reason. "You're good," he said. Pam gave a small smile. "I will try." He nodded. Then he lowered his voice so only she could hear. "I wasn't brought in to watch, Pam. I was brought in to control." Pam raised an eyebrow. "To control what exactly?" Reynolds exhaled. His eyes were serious. "Judge Harrison doesn't like losing. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example." Pam already knew that, but hearing it out loud made the victory feel even bigger. She kept her voice calm. "So what happens now?" Reynolds hesitated. Then he looked at her with both respect and warning. "People will be watching you. And not just in this courtroom." Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today she had done more than win a case. She had challenged a system that expected people to follow rules without question. And people had noticed. She nodded. "I appreciate the warning." Reynolds gave her one last look before turning back toward the courtroom. Pam turned toward the exit, pushing open the heavy courthouse doors. Bright sunlight hit her face. The air outside felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought in court, and it wouldn't be the last. She had learned something today. Power wasn't about sitting in a big chair or wearing a robe. It wasn't about titles or authority. Power was knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was standing tall when people expected you to back down. And most of all, power was knowing that just because someone makes a decision, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a normal case. Instead, she had reminded everyone, especially those in charge, that the law wasn't just about rules. It was about understanding. It was about fighting back. And today she had done exactly that. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.